So welcome to Elder Talk 5. Before we get going too far, this event is being sponsored once again by the Little Lake Grange and the Willits Economic Localization. We would like to make a special thank you to our video technicians, Maestro Al Rosen, Andrew Wright on camera, Virginia Sterling on camera, and Steve Hellman on camera. So thank you so much for coming and documenting this for us. And we have sound technician is Tom DeMarkey. Thank you, Tom. This is fantastic. Appreciate all your help. This event is going to be broadcast on willitstv.org, so it'll be broadcasting not only on local channel 3, I believe, but on the World Wide Web. Wondering if there are any family members here tonight yet?
Who are the family and friends of Ed Burton? Identify yourselves. No one? Ah! Oh.
Yeah, got one.
I think it's going to be a roast, folks.
I had a friend once.
Here's a new friend. Here's Howard.
Here comes Howard.
Okay. So let's see here. We would like to call your attention to the Grange building restoration. I think there's some pictures up front there. We're addressing years, if not decades, worth of deferred maintenance on this building, and it's finally caught up with us, but currently we're just redoing the roof, and that's going to be about a $100,000 roof replacement by the time it's done. The front entryway has been refloored, and lots of big plans are underway for bringing the Little Lake Grange into the 21st century. And we're going to need a lot of help, and it's going to take an entire community to save this historic building. So we are going to be rolling out plans on that in the very near future. Curious if anyone has gone to school here in the past. Any of you former? Helen? Yes. Wonderful. That's wonderful.
Well, Edie went to school
And
here.
Edie, there we go. Edie graduated. I believe you graduated from the stage here, didn't you? That's fantastic.
Right about here?
And Helen as well. That's wonderful. So we're going to try and bring the building back to how you remember it when you were a student here. Is that a good thing? So we few Grange members, we can't afford to fix it up. It's going to be several $100,000, but it's a very important current project, and if you have any ideas or if you'd like to help us with some donations, we would sure appreciate that.
So I'll talk to you a little bit about why we're here, what is Elder Talk, and what conceived it. We really feel, for many reasons, the stories of our elders are an important continuity that we don't want to lose. And I think with the way families live today, with coming and going so quickly through the household, there's not much time to hear stories of your family elders. And so we're promoting it as a family community here, hoping that people will take this home. It's almost Thanksgiving, so maybe it's a good time to roll out some of those old family pictures. Talk about the family history. Let those youngsters know the crazy or wild or sad or funny, whatever, stories of the past so that they don't get lost. And we encourage you to do this type of thing in your own family, as well as how we are organizing it here. So our ancestors had an ancient cultural tradition of oral tradition storytelling, and we're waking that up. We want to know that the lessons of the past so that we don't forget them, and they are a bridge to the future. Remember that. So what happened before can help us understand how to remake the future. And we're hoping for nuggets tonight from Ed that help us understand how to get some more economic boost in our community, as well as how it used to be done. So just an aside on that, I've been studying my own family history, and my great uncle and my grandfather, and there were 7 kids, they wrote these round robin letters, and one set of letters survived, and so there's this incredible family history that goes back to the 30s in these letters. And I made a book out of the letters, and that plus a video, sent it out to the family, and it was really a great and funny thing to see my mom driving a tractor at age 12 and what was going on, you know, way back when, and encouraging you to do that. And also the town I was raised in, Charlotte, Michigan, it's a small Midwestern town. They made a book, and it has photos of the town 100 years ago and talking about all the businesses. And it was amazing. 100 years ago, there was this town of like 5,000 people. There was a woolen mill. They even had a car factory once automobiles were started up, and they were making all these things for themselves, rope, and you know, clothing, and selling things on Main Street that pretty much took care of most people's needs. So it was an opportunity back then to just be in the town and have what you needed. And that's one thing that Willits Economic Localization is hoping, that we can rediscover some of these self-reliant possibilities, make some new businesses happen here, take ourselves forward that way. So these talks are part of that process, and we appreciate you coming tonight.
I'd like to read a little quote here. So, what can we do? What do we have here in Mendocino County we can use or sell so money will come into our economy? What can we use to produce food, water, and energy when there is less rain every year? At the same time, we may earn less money from our investments. First, we must use it up, wear it out, make do, or do without. That was written in last week's There Is a Better Way column by our guest tonight, Ed Burton.
Those of us that went through the real depression, I don't hope we aren't in another one, but that was the first rule. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. And I can see nodding out there in the audience, and that was my mother's motto. And actually, I was 8 years old in 1932, so I spent all my teen years in the bottom of the Depression in Santa Cruz, across the bay from Monterey, where John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, and we had the Bell family in town, in our neighborhood. It was very much like the Jode family in The Grapes of Wrath. So they actually become the good old days now, but at the time we lived them, they weren't very good. And as we face this situation today, you have to realize that the government simply can't do what it has done. We'll see how this new administration works out, but we're broke. That's a simple fact. If you divide $11 trillion, those of you that know math, that's a trillion is 11 times 10 to the 12th. That's 12 zeros after the 11. If you divide it by 300 million, which is the number of people in the U.S., it comes to $32,000 for every man, woman, and child is owed to some foreign investor. And I think in that column I use the example, and back in those days, if you worked like the lumber towns, Union, Scotia, Samoa, you had the company store and you could charge there. They paid by cash in those days, and that was deducted before you got your cash. But if you got over half of your wages in debt, why then they crank down. But that's what we have to face today. It's won't be all that bad. We have, and Willits is a good place to do it. And I think that the curious thing now is that the money that Hattie and I set aside for our old age, and Hattie died over 2 years ago, has been invested in stocks and all of that. And in the last month, the trust has lost so much money, I would be embarrassed to tell you, but the money that I've invested in this Jurgen shear and the other equipment now will go on operating on solar power, and as long as the sun shines and the winds blow, why, that will supply the power, and then that will process the wood, and we can do a much better job than they did in World War II. In Germany and Japan, all the cars ran on wood, and we know that process, the downdraft gasifier. And Dr. Tom Reed, who's visited here in Willits, has been our silent partner in all this, and we think that that as bad as it gets, it will still be possible for us to prosper here in Willits.
Thank you, Ed. That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
You should have interrupted sooner.
No, I
Kathy.
like that. I like that. It's wonderful. It's exactly what we're talking about here and why we're here. So we'll start with that wonderful introduction. Let's start back at your birth and your early childhood. Can you tell us where you were born and a few
January
things?
24th, 1924, and in Santa Cruz. And those of you that have been to the university at Santa Cruz, you drove up Mission Hill and then up, and you passed on the left, you passed High Street, which is, I think, almost the last street to the left before you get up to where the university campus is, and that's where I was born. And but I left there when I was about 3 and moved to the other side of town. The rich people lived over on the Mission Hill. The Brantford district was a step down in a way and a step up in another. And I'm tempted to tell us, I was about 2 or 3, I guess 2, and I had an older sister, Annie Ruth. We all called her Annie Ruth even though she was my sister. And she and her girlfriends were there, and High Street went level, but it was on a hill. So they got after Mother to let them take the baby buggy and wheel me up and down High Street. And I guess they did, and that turned out to be kind of boring. So at the end of the street where the side street went down, they got this game of turning the buggy loose, and then the girl downhill would catch the buggy and wheel it back up. And Mother looked out the window and saw this occurring, and of course she screamed at Ruth to stop, at which point the girl that was supposed to catch me ran home, and evidently I went down and across the ditch and flew out into the grass, and that was my first adventure. I don't recall it very well.
And that's why you're brilliant today. You got that head opened up. Tell us about the Gladiola picking, the Grapes of Wrath, kind of style story about you picking gladiolas.
Yeah. Well, Santa Cruz, of course, was famous for its flowers. And when I was 13, I got a job in a gladiola field, weeding gladiolas, and they grow about that far apart, and you go on your hands and knees with a little thing like a kitchen knife and weed in between the stalks. And I got $1.50 a day on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. We got Saturdays off. They ship the flowers to the San Francisco flower market. On those days, you went to work at 8 in the morning, and at 6 in the evening, if you were still working, they gave you a hamburger and a Coke, free. They made it, and you kept working until all the flowers were in the truck. Since both my parents were teachers, and they had my boss was Paul Tolman that owned the thing. I guess my mother must have called Paul Tolman because after a few weeks of that, why, I was told to go home after the 6 o'clock Coke and thing.
She had been Paul Tolman's teacher, right? Yeah, so she had a little influence. Well, let's take you forward then. You want to take over, RJ, with some of the Eagle Rock Forestry Camp?
Yeah, I want to bring up this picture here, which, how old were you in this picture?
This is the picture that was on the poster.
Yeah, that's the Eagle Rock Forestry Camp, and I was there for 2 summers, but we built our tent cabin on our time. It was on the watershed of the Coast Counties Gas and Electric, which has been since bought by PG&E. They had a hydroelectric dam, and we made fire trails and brush dams. And I see they have a brush dam up at Summer Lake in Brook Trails right now. They just put in a brush dam. That slows up the water so it deposits the silt. And it's something like the swales that Dr. Jason Bradford put in.
What year was this picture taken? When did you start working with brush?
That was, I was 17, that was 1939 and 40.
And who was the foreman on this crew?
Well, of course, that was my dad, who taught chemistry and biology and was also a Cal Forester. I thought maybe my son Bruce would be here tonight, but my dad was a Cal Forester, sort of. There wasn't a forestry program at Cal when he went, but he took all of the forest courses and is considered a pioneer in the Cal Forestry game. But anyway, and then there was me, and then I went to Cal, and that's where my dad met my mother. He was a cross-country runner, and mother belonged to the women's hiking club. And the cross-country runners thought it'd be a good idea to invite the women hiking club to take the Cog Railroad up Mount Tamalpais and then hike to the top. You know, the Cog Railroad didn't go all the way to the top. And that's how Dad met Mother. So at any rate, this high school forestry camp the Coast Counties came up with enough to pay us 40 cents an hour, which was a big, very high wage at that point. We built fire trails, and the university also, the University Extension and Woody Metcalf were frequent visitors, and they made a sound movie. It's called A New Dawn in an Ancient Forest. I showed it to my forestry class when I taught forestry for the city of Oakland while I was still in Berkeley, and also when I taught forestry here. It was a wonderful thing to be a part of. And looking at this picture, the lead in the movie was Jack Woods. He has a brother, Richard Wood, that lives in Potter Valley, but Jack was killed when a mortar blew up while he was training in Texas. And I'm afraid that many of them that are in this picture, I dare say most of them or all of them were involved in World War II, because of course that happened in 1941. But it was a great thing to be a part of, and Dave Hope, that lived here in Willits for a number of years, was also in the Eagle Rock Forestry.
So I'm going to just interrupt you here, and just if you get a theme here tonight, one is that Ed has a passion for cutting brush. He was cutting brush as a teen, and he's still cutting brush, and he's figured out better ways to cut brush, and we'll be showing you a demonstration on this, what's now currently known as the Jurgen shear later, and we'll talk more about that, what you're looking at here. So let's go on to Willits.
Actually, before we do, I just wanted to say this has been very difficult gleaning this conversation down. We just have really a few minutes tonight, a couple of hours. In previous years, Ed has published at least 2 books that I've been able to find on some of his old columns, and some of these stories and documentations are just fascinating. But before we bring it up to Willits, I just wanted to say, in those subsequent 70 years that you've been cutting brush, there's a few other things that you've done, such as you were a radio operator mechanic, you were into air-sea rescue in the war, you were a postal worker, timber cruiser, a school teacher, a company forester, research director, Willits High School Board of Director, Howard Hospital Board of Director. You served on the Mendocino County Grand Jury, and in recent decades you've been in the invention racket. So you've
I'd
stayed
forgotten
busy.
some of that.
So you want to do this
Yes.
excerpt from May 4th, 1984. He wrote a column, was writing columns all the way back then, and this is all about self-reliance.
So this is locally here in the Little Lake Valley. The cash crops of former years were dairy products, row crops, orchards, sheep, cattle, and other things that the hills around here produced. The area between the high school and the railroad had corrals for holding hundreds of head of livestock. Spring Grove Creamery produced milk, butter, and ice cream. Much of the logging and farm machinery was repaired or made in Monk Ross's shop and others. There was a big blacksmith shop where the Rendezvous parking lot is now. And of course the telephone switchboard was the current Hava Java cafe. And even back here in 84, you were talking about if Willits were cut off from the outside world in 1940, it would have been hard, but the town would have survived. So I just thought you might want to use that as a takeoff on Willits and some of the businesses that you've been involved in those years. You had linkage to some of the founders of this community, Russell Ells, Vivian and Frank. I'll just name drop a few names, then you can tell us a story or two. The Russell Ells, Vivian and Frank Crawford, Earl Mayes, Bob Hara, Jack Harwood, the Wagonettes, to name but a few.
Yeah, I've been involved in almost all of those. Of course, I came to Willits. If you asked me what I was going to do, everybody did, of course, during the war. What are you going to do when you get back? Well, I was going to be a watershed engineer. It was manage watersheds for the most water. So when I was going to Berkeley, I got a job with the East Bay Municipal Utilities District, in their forestry department in the summers. We planted all those pine trees that grow around the Rind Reservoir, and all of the reservoirs had these pine trees because they had heard the story, and you've probably heard it, that the trees put water up in the air and it makes it rain during the summertime. So they, of course, need water in their reservoirs in the summertime, so these trees were going to make it rain. But of course, it couldn't make it rain if the trees couldn't take water out of the dry ground in Orinda. So anyway, I watered pine trees and fought fires. Incidentally, got caught in a forest fire, in a grass fire. It was actually wheat stubble, right near St. Mary's College out by Moraga. But anyway, they had this, Jackson, the superintendent, had budget trouble, so he says, Burton, says, why don't you take a little couple days and do some research about all of these trees making it rain in the summertime. So wow, here I hadn't even graduated and I'm a consultant. So I did. I looked it up and of course found out the obvious fact that if it doesn't rain to get water in the soil, the trees can't put water up in the air to make it come down as rain. So I wrote all this in a report, and of course, which sort of said that this whole thing has been a big mistake and they shouldn't have financed it in the first place. Pretty naive in those days, but I thought they'd be pleased to know the truth. And all of a sudden they quit talking about me having a professional forester on the staff hiring me, you know, for the job. So I got a chance to work as company forester for Russell Ells, and I came to Willits. So that's how that all happened.
What year was that?
That was 1950.
In those subsequent years, you were around for the founding of, I'll just name a few companies here, Remco, Micro4, Little Lake Industries, what used to be AM&D, now Metal FX.
Yeah.
You were involved in some way, shape, or form, and I think
AM&D actually started down around San Jose somewhere, and he moved up here to have less rent and all. Gary Ramos and I can't think of the other. Well, Jerry Caldwell and there was another one. But the Russell Ells was a civil engineer, and back in those days, all of the foresters referred to civil engineers as SIs, and SIs stands for civil engineers because civil engineers can't spell very well, you see. So anyway, there was always kind of a friendly give and take between Russell and I. My desk was in his office, and in a way we were instrumental in starting the Redwood Region Conservation Council, which really was sort of behind the first forest practice rules, and Russell was the first head of the State Board of Forestry, which now is busily keeping a lid on, well, we won't go into that, but anyway, many things started here in Willits, and Bob Harrah, during the war, Bob was working on the emergency dam that was a one-time shot. If the Japanese had bombed the dam on the Panama Canal and caused that lake to drain, it would take 30 years to fill the lake. So there was a dam, secret dam that was constructed that would come up and take the place of the other dam in case the main dam was bombed. We were so desperate that would have probably caused the Japanese to win the war.
Are you saying that here in Willits we were developing technology for that dam, which is in
No,
Panama?
he was. Bob was a machinist and a welder, and he was an oil field worker as a young boy. He came up, his brother had a sawmill in Branscombe, and in those days the cats didn't have any overhead protection or anything, and no bulldozers. They were very rare. And Bob was skidding some logs down one day, and what we used to call bananas, that is peeled redwood log. They're real slick, and it ran ahead of he was going downhill, and it ran ahead of the cat and turned the cat around so it was pointing back uphill, and that was enough logging for Bob. And he went down and he asked Jane how long it'd take for her to get ready to leave Branscombe. She says, well, 10 minutes be too long. And he came to town, and there where Sherwood Road goes up, where that gas station is, over the creek was a building there, and Bob rented it for a machine shop, and that was the beginning of Harrah Machine Works. And he could see along about 1950 or so that the sawmill machinery thing was going to die out, and he determined to make higher quality cylinders. And Bob was a genius, and 2 years junior college, but he could see things that others couldn't. And quite an inventor, heck of a guy. Anyway, at the height of it, they were making the biggest cylinders in the world. And the cylinders that kept the spacecraft level of going from where it was made until the launch pad was was made here in Willits.
And that's Remco. Are you talking about Remco there?
What?
Remco, the industry?
That was, he switched, Harrow Brothers Machine Works became Remco. They bought the patents for a new type of seal, and the company was in Petaluma. And Bob and I used to fly to Petaluma, and Bob was great at buying machinery for another purpose and adapting it. And he thought I could speak French or read French. And I remember there at 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm struggling to tell him, that's the lathe, everything was in French. And anyway, another one of those little stories that could go on and on. So
Thank you, Ed.
I'd like to bring up one of those little stories, and it involves someone by the name of Earl Mayes.
Oh, yeah.
And this is about innovation and how Earl Mayes supported innovation in this community to a great extent. And were you hired by Earl Mayes, or how did you end up in this story? You went out.
That's how Mays Field got its name. It's M-A-I-Z-E. And Earl was born on the peninsula. His father came to Willits to manage Willits Light and Power. Willits had its own light and power system then. I seen someone nodding that they knew that. That's
right. That's one of those facts we want to note for the future.
That's another story.
Anyway, Earl and Bob and Jim were the three boys, and Martha, who later married Roland Johnsrud, grew up here in Willits. And the Bob and Jim built the hardware store out on Miracle Mile, and then they had the cabinet shop in the back that made cabinets, and they operated the hardware store and was very successful. And then they had ambitions, and they bought Higher Hardware in Los Angeles, and which was a small thing that made the hardware on drawers and cabinets, and built it into a very big company and retired into the Santa Rosa area. But Earl Mayes became part of this threesome of Frank Crawford, who owned the sawmill first between Longvale and Dos Rios, then Covelo, then Redding, then Ukiah, then Sebastopol and all. And then what to do with the land after they'd logged it. And Brook Trails, of course, had a sawmill until 1929, and which was sort of the center of the area. It had the hospital, and it had the school, and it had everything. They determined to subdivide Brook Trails, and I could go on all night on that. They were stockholders in Remco, and it was all kind of a mutual thing. And then they bought stock in Microfor, which was at the meeting they called.
I want to talk about Microfor in a minute, because that's really an important possibility for our future. But let's go back to Earl Myers and the Earl Mayes and the egg beater, the egg washer story. You were sent to the valley to look at somebody's invention.
Oh, Mayes. Mayes was full of enthusiasm. We used to have a bowling alley here where the auto parts store is now. And so Earl and Sally and Hattie and I were a team. I won't tell the bowling story, but the Mayes got the idea, when Microfor looked like a pretty good idea, that they would finance people that came to him with an invention, and a local invention, and they'd look at it, or I would look at it, and then report to the three on whether it looked feasible. So we had someone here in town that had a brother-in-law that had an egg business I don't remember where. Anyway, he was down visiting his sister and brother-in-law, and he was out helping his brother-in-law feed eggs into an egg washer. And it was kind of a boring job, and anyway, he had a vision of how eggs could be fed into the egg washer out of a wire basket. So he did. He built this thing, and he put salt in the water to make the eggs float. And the eggs all floated to the surface, and he had little jets that made the eggs go up this little alleyway, you might say, and then the thing picked up the egg wash and went, and by golly, it worked. So anyway, I went out to look at this. It was out by the Valley Oaks Trailer Park, and there wasn't a blade of grass on this front lawn because the salt had killed all the grass. But there were all the kids standing there with Daddy's new invention, so they were all going to be rich. And when I got there, why, they lowered the egg basket full of eggs in there, and the eggs floated, and they started up the machine. And of course, they didn't have an egg washer, but you could see how it would work to feed this eggs in an egg washer. But of course, the obvious question is, well, what does the salt do to the eggs? That brought a tirade from the poor guy. He says, you know, those professors don't know anything. I guess he showed it over at Davis, and I wasn't supposed to ask that question, I guess. Anyway, so it became obvious that this wasn't a winner. So how to ease yourself out of this? And so I said, well, you know, I have to report, and I don't, and then so on. And so as I was leading, he says, wait. And he ran into the house, and he got a deed to the house, and says, if I'd help him get this thing going, why, I could have his house. And so I went back and told Mayes, get yourself another looker at new inventions. That's too tough on me. Those kids practically in tears. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, innovations are what you do, and we love the fact that you worked at trying to make them happen, helping people out, whether that story turned out. And what do you got next, RJ?
Well, water is on everyone's mind here in Little Lake Valley, and we've had water shortages before, and looks like we're there again. I know you've been in and out of the sanitation business and have come up with some ideas. In fact, you've come up with some products. We're looking at one right here. Could you?
Yeah, this is our marker for EcoChamber, which has been improved by Phil Jurgensen. Basically, redwood bark is a waste product. I should point out that I didn't develop these things on my own money. They were supported by all of the redwood companies and the California Redwood Association. And we did. We made home systems and a toilet that flushed with the recycled water and all. And it's, I'll tell you, the principle is really quite simple, and came about in an interesting way because I was also working on filtering the Cottrell dust that comes out of the cement plant when you make Portland cement. And there's a cement plant between San Francisco and Santa Cruz at Davenport. Then the cement dust would just cover that whole country down there. And what to do with it. And they had well, it's quite complicated, but working on that gave me the introduction to the van der Waals forces, which is any cellulose fiber attracts a colloid. You know, water isn't really H2O, it's HOH. It's the hydrogen ion and the hydroxyl ion. But anyway, what happens when water gets attached to the cellulose fiber, there's a residual charge that reaches across and grabs a colloid. And the ink, the little particles are colloidal. They don't like each other while they're in the ink. But when you put a cellulose fiber near them, why, it goes over and attaches onto it. So that's why the modern inks, you don't need the blotter like we used to have, where we'd have to let the ink dry on the paper. But that is the key, or the quote, the secret, or the patent on the microfour thing, was the van der Waals forces. And Dad introduced me to that on a camping trip at 11,000 feet in the White Mountains when we were studying the Bristol cone pine, but that's another story.
Now, the pines and the redwoods, I think, are of interest to us. What we're trying to get around to here through, getting to know Ed better is the incredible opportunity we have here with our forest byproducts and biomass, things that are available to us locally that we could build an economy on. Is one thing we really did want to spend a little time on. Do you mind talking a little more about the Bristol cone pine, but then all about how that relates to redwood?
Well, I don't know if you've ever thought of it, but all of you that have been around a while have lived with redwood water tanks. Many of them are still in operation here. They last. And you ever wonder why you aren't poisoned? Because after all, the wood decays because bugs, termites, or bacteria will actually eat cellulose. And it's a very simple but a very hard thing to explain. But redwood, there are 500 identified chemicals in redwood that make it into a herbicide and a bactericide. It's not poisonous to humans, because many of us have lived our whole life on water out of redwood tanks. That is a rather curious thing, curious bit of chemistry, because if we take the red out of redwood, we can extract it with toluene, with all sorts of solvents, and hot water, we can extract the red out of it. And I had the brilliant idea of extracting the chemical out of redwood bark and injecting it into a pine board, which would make you an instant redwood board. Well, it rots just like any old pine board. It doesn't make it durable. That has always been something it's interested me. Why can't we use that then as a salve or something? And a fellow down in Petaluma invented this redwood salve, which some people thought was a great idea, and he did. He just took the dusty part of redwood bark, mixed it with a solid alcohol, and that became redwood salve, and sold it. And our friendly bureaucracy, I guess he made some claims that it, did everything but set broken bones. Anyway, the Food and Drug shut him down. And poor guy didn't have any money, couldn't fight it. And so he brought me his records and some of the salve. And some people thought it was really good. Well, I was on a cruise down in the Caribbean, and one of the other passengers had been to a doctor from the Mayo Clinic, and he'd been to a burn seminar. So I was telling him about this redwood salve and how it might be effective to keep the infection away from a burn. By golly, he thought that was a pretty good idea, and we corresponded back and forth. So I went down to Petaluma to see this fellow, tell him that I had, because I had other things I was working on. I couldn't take time for it. And he had died. So that's the end of the story. It's still a possibility. So Redwood could make redwood salve for burns, and
So write that down, you herbalists, got that? So there's a lot of other forestry byproduct innovations and investigations you've made. Do you want to read that?
Here's a couple right here,
Oh,
for
okay, there you
instance. Maybe you could
yeah,
talk
this
a moment or two about some of these.
Phil can tell you. That's a name of a what's that word?
Pegasus?
You make so all of it.
Oh, Escher, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, this is Manzanita, and this is tan oak, I think. We can dry it, and this was cut with a laser. All you had to do was set the pattern up and lay the boards out, and this thing burned these cuts absolutely accurate. You can see they fit together, and with no distortion on the wood. There's no strain on the wood, so nothing breaks off. You can see the little tail here would, if you did that with a saw, there'd be a chance that it would break. And we can make anything out of very small boards. And Manzanita, as you know, is very hard to dry, but we can dry it if we cut the Manzanita and cut the board within hours. We can't allow it to dry out in the round. Our stress is set up, and then it'll be warped. But you can see we made perfectly straight boards, and we're cut. These machines work with the lights off. There isn't anybody at the machine. It's all automatic.
Now, this was done locally here. These
This was
were cut
done
locally
locally.
at AM&D,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
And these were madrone.
Those are different. Those were dies that were made by Ace Dye in San Francisco that made the little hexagons out of very thin Manzanita. And Manzanita, if you finish it, these aren't finished, but any of the fine varnishes or oils will make a very attractive wood. And you can see these, it can be carved or made into anything that will work. And would this be a good time to talk about the grid beam?
It's
Yeah.
another potential product for
Value-added
small diameter
forestry
wood, sure.
products.
What?
Tell us
Yeah,
everything.
there's a little piece there.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a grid beam, and there's another thing that Phil has had a big part in the development of.
Can Phil Jurgensen identify himself in the audience?
Yeah.
There's Phil. He's
There's-
an inventor also, works
Yeah.
with Ed.
And these holes are very precision. Now this is Douglas fir, and we have in the woods what we call buggy whips. These are long, thin fir that tried like everything to stay up with its big brother over here that got to be 2 feet in diameter. Now they're 150 feet tall, hardly any knots in them, very, very strong, and only 6-8 inches in diameter. And that is the material that would make an ideal, very, very strong grid beam. I don't think the group has really fully explored that whole idea. That's what we need to remove from our forests to let the larger trees put on growth just at the time when we go out and cut them. A 2-foot tree going to a 36-inch tree is a very profitable operation. To cut a tree that's about 2 feet in diameter, it's a moneymaker, but not like a tree that's 36 inches in diameter producing clear wood, particularly in the Doug fir. And right now, Doug fir you can hardly give away, so in a way it isn't the time to do it, but that is the possibility that this could be made out of the 4 or 5, 6, 8-inch trees and make the wood very long. And then this would then be a member. And remember, the Howard Hughes Spruce Goose is all made out of wood, the biggest airplane that ever flew. And Howard Hughes was a great inventor, and I'd like the time to go up and study that spruce goose. It's now up in Oregon.
We're going to keep talking about trees and wood.
Just found one great article here on tan oak. But here's a great column here on June 6th, 1984, where you're talking about tan oak and the poison oakers. And,
yeah.
And how tan oak really is not an oak tree. Maybe you could talk a little bit about tan oak.
Yeah. Tan oak, this goes back to the 30s, and it was true in Santa Cruz County. I'm sure it was, I know it was true here. When I was, 14, 15, I was cutting cordwood. We cut it then 4 feet long, and split it down so it was not more than 6 inches in diameter, or 6 inch, anyway. And we got $8 in the woods, stacked cord, or $10 roadside. And that meant we had to carry it on our shoulder. At that same time, tan bark was, you could get $80 a cord for it when it was dried and taken to the A.K. Saul's tannery. So tan bark from a tan oak tree was worth around 8 times what cordwood was worth. So that made it valuable enough, and that's why out here you see the oxen with the tan bark on it carrying the tan bark into town. That's Walker, Charlie Walker. Was it Charlie? Yeah. That's what he did. Later, he was the carpenter at Willits Redwood Products, where I worked, before he got to be almost 100 also, I think. But anyway.
There was Mark Walker?
Yes.
What?
Mark Walker or Charlie?
Yeah, Mike Walker.
Mark, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, the tan oak was the money crop for the poison oakers that lived out in the hills. Tan oak and wool. Wool today doesn't pay for what you get for wool doesn't pay for the cost of shearing.
I looked at Helen when you said that. Helen's paying to have her sheep sheared every year and can't find a market for it.
2.5 a head for shearing.
Yeah, 2.5 for shearing, and how much do you get for the pelt or the fleece? Like a couple bucks more, right? It's hardly worth it.
Yeah.
Well, we need a wool business here, kids. What can we do?
They don't make uniforms anymore out of wool.
Yeah, I think World War II, there was a huge upsurge in woolens for the...
2.5 pounds.
Yeah, so now there's no market for wool. People don't wear wool clothes as much. We're not making local yarns, so, put that on your notebook too. Maybe there's... Yep, so natural fibers, there are people. And Donna DeTerra recently built a cabin, and she insulated the whole cabin with raw wool pelts, fleeces, fleeces. So there is something happening.
Ed, this leads into dried wood and the energy in wood and how that computes to gasoline.
Yeah, the wood, green wood, is really not a very good product. I mean, it's heavy, it's hard to light, it's almost impossible to burn without making smoke. But dry wood, and now we have to sort of define what dry wood is. Wood, green wood that's growing in the woods will be about half water, so that based on the dry weight, it's about 100% moisture. In other words, based on the dry weight, it's about half. Now, all of these things vary a lot with species and so on, but just to keep it simple, wood dries down to what's called the fiber saturation point at about 30%, rather not quickly, but in a matter of a week or two. It very often on a hot, dry climate, why it will get to 30%. Going from 30% to 20%, which is considered stove wood dry, is relatively easy, but much harder than going from the 100 to the 30. Then going below the 20 to 13%, which is the equilibrium moisture content here in this area, is very difficult. Going below that to 8% has to be done artificially. You can't do that in the air. So at around 10% moisture, wood has about 10,000 BTUs a pound. So gasoline has about 120, between 100 and 110,000 BTUs a gallon. And so wood is about a tenth the price of a gallon of gasoline or diesel. I think I've lost my math here somewhere. But wood is worth around 15 cents a pound if it's down in the 10% moisture range. And that means you have to have some kind of outside heat to get it dry. Now, wood dries only from the end. Wood doesn't dry out through the bark, or it dries very little. So that's why we want it very short, and we'll get into that later.
Yeah.
But that's, I don't know how deeply you want to go into these things.
What he did tell us before is that 12 pounds of dry tan oak equals the energy in a gallon of gas.
Right.
So if you had 12 pounds of dry tan oak, it's the same energy as a gallon of gas, and that's a really useful tool. A gallon of gas is actually, we shouldn't be blowing it out of our tailpipes. It's really, really valuable as an energy source in other ways.
Now, it's more important than that. If you go to Germany and Japan and all of the countries that ran on wood, you can gasify, and we ought to get into that.
Yeah, talk about gasification. It's
All right.
a way
Now,
we can heat.
If
do
we
energy.
if we don't dry the wood and we heat it, of course the moisture comes off, and hot water will dissolve the lignin in wood and the other extractives, so that then the smoke that goes when it gets into the gas engine or whatever, it coats the cylinder rings and all of the parts of the carburetor that are involved. So while it will run on green wood, won't run very long. So the feeling at the end of World War II, when people could go back to gasoline, everybody gave up on using wood. But today we know more about drying wood, and with the Jurgen shear and the spiral shear that we have here, that you'll see, we can cut the wood very silently and easily at the rate of 1 a second. We turn out these little chunkettes, which can be dried to the 8% moisture, which is the ideal fuel for gasification. Once you have the gasifier going, and then you can use the excess heat to dry the wood. So you'll see that here, and I'm talking too long.
No,
You're
doing great.
it's about you talking, Ed. Tonight you get to talk.
I wanted to bring up, in the process of doing research for this interview, we got to spend some time with Ed in his office, which is like a miniature schoolroom. There's a blackboard in there, and it's filled with equations, and it gets a lot of use, and you sit on a sofa, and you're surrounded by patents and photographs and old popular mechanics and popular science and
Half-finished projects.
the ever-finished McMaster car catalog, which is pretty much the ultimate catalog for inventors and designers and builders. I see a few in the audience here. Environmental organic chemistry, lots of fascinating books and information on the walls. You are still referring to this and ordering things frequently, if not weekly, aren't you? Out of
Yeah.
McMaster Carr?
Yeah, McMaster Carr is the inventor's friend. It has everything that you could possibly want. And and it's high quality, and of course it with modern technology you can call there, and how they find it in the warehouse and get it and ship it so you get it the next day is unbelievable. You know, we do many things very, very well in the United States of America. To think that this catalog and the warehouses are so well organized that no matter what you order out of that catalog, they'll have it here in Willits tomorrow morning. And it's unbelievable.
Here's a picture rather recently taken. What's going on here?
Oh, well, that's Phil feeding a small stick through the spiral shear, which is my end of that invention, and then the...
It's called the spiral shear, and it's this unit here.
Yeah. We'll actually run that here pretty quick.
Yeah, we're
Now,
pretty close
Ed,
to that
Ed,
point.
haven't you filed some patents recently? And speaking of
Yeah,
patents,
actually that has 2 patents. On this end, which is a Jurgen shear, it cuts the material up to 2 inches pretty reliably, and maybe a little more than that if the wood's green. And on the other end, it cuts the brush, all of the twigs and branches into 2-inch lengths. Now that actually would make browse food. That's what cattle and sheep and all feed on when they're in the pasture. But it's also led to this twigs and stems, which I'm using, and it's for we actually will be condensing water using twigs and stems. I don't want to get into that now.
That's your slime technology.
Yeah,
in the
It's
twig-
an
in the
interesting
twig tower.
other chemistry.
in the twig tower, yeah.
So this has 2 recent patents that you filed, and I'm wondering how many patents have you filed for, and how many of them have actually had a financial return for you?
I have 23 U.S. patents, and I think there are 3 or 4 foreign patents which are just identical to the U.S. patents. 5 of them have made money. The power bar debarker, and one of my products that I sold for 30 years, the log scale computer, was sold up and down the coast here for 30 years, and I never got a patent on it. It had actually been invented in 1870, although they couldn't make it because they didn't have the materials that we had now. So, no, the patent business is very good. Like with Microfor, we had the patents, we had the Class 1 overboard discharge for the railroads and for the oceans, and we had the food and drug approval, because some of you are old enough to remember on the railroad, the toilet waste went directly on the track. And it was the Food and Drug Administration where the flies would go from the waste to the cabbage patch or the lettuce field that actually was the thing. And that's a whole story in itself, because I couldn't get Southern Pacific to give me a no-fee purchase order. They wouldn't take a system for nothing, and that was the NWP was going to put it on, and I'd been there and had been unsuccessful, and finally I was called to a meeting, and the head of Southern Pacific of biogeny And Mike Gogol, the head of engines, was worried because he thought we were going to put monogram systems on.
Are you talking about your marine sanitation device, the
Yeah,
Microfor?
marine sanitation device.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a Microfor product. It's still being made?
What?
Is it still being
Oh, my
made? Yeah.
Eddie here in town was way up in northern Finland, way up north of the Arctic Circle. And she went in to use the potty, and there on the lid it said, Microfor, Willits, California. She says, I almost burst into tears. But Point Barrow, Alaska is all on, that was one of our first big jobs, was all of the toilets in Point Barrow, Alaska are Microfor.
Okay, so we're getting near the end of this stage part. We're going to use the machines in a minute, but you have anything else you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Ed to briefly speak to something that you've started here called the Inventor's Workshop.
Oh, yeah.
What is that? Who's in it?
Well, one of the things that's true about the inventing business, you think you can go on and create another big winner. So we sold Microfor in 1981, and of course that was a very profitable thing to do, and I'd always had this dream of having a wood-fired power plant. And so I thought, by gosh, I got all this money, I think I'll just go build a wood-fired power plant. So I invented the clean smoke burner, which pushes the new material under the burning mass. I won't go into it, but it worked. Everything looked great. And I was even on the PG&E Progress. Remember the thing you used to send in the bill? And I'm shaking hands with the vice president of PG&E, and boy, I was a big hero because now they were going to make energy out of wood.
Ed's going to go down and they're going to play with some wood and do something real here.
Well, last time we had Ed here, he was operating a chainsaw.
Yeah, we had chainsaws going, and was it you, Edie, that was using the chainsaw in the middle of the room here? Or, what was happening? There was a lot of ruckus going on, and stuff was flying everywhere. But tonight we're trying to keep it clean.
Is this working? Okay, there we go. Yeah, my name is Phil Jurgensen. I've been working with Ed for 10 years now.
Wow.
And when I started there, actually, the first project he put me on was this device here called a spiral shear. And as Ed said, this is something you can feed small brush and branches through, and it reduces it dramatically, about 10-fold in size. And it does a similar thing that a chipper would do, but it doesn't break it down quite as small. This side of the machine is something Ed has called the Jurgens shear. He's named it after me. I kind of came up with the blade design. Professor Reed in Colorado, I kind of liked his name. He calls it the Chunketeer. And you'll see why in a minute. Anyway, the machine is battery powered. This black case down here is full of batteries, lead acid batteries. And of course, with batteries, we can charge this thing with sunshine. So out in the field, we would probably use about 4 panels, solar panels on it, and it would probably run it most of the day. Howard here helped us do the wiring on it. I'm not very good with wiring, and Howard is one of the best, so he's helped us with the switching on it also. I guess we can turn it on and show you what it does. It's a little squeaky, but it is pretty quiet compared to its gasoline counterparts. I'm going to have to set this down.
I'll hold it. This is the important thing. I'll pass a few of these around because they do dry very rapidly, and we can feed those automatically into a stove so that you could set. We have, with the modern equipment now, that would sense that there's a low fire or need more heat, and it'll automatically feed. It's called the tumble feed drying system. And so that we can run the power plant or the clean smoke burner automatically without someone shoveling the chunkettes into it.
Does it work the same with dry wood?
Oh yeah, this is,
Well, I see you have green. Does it work the same with dry wood?
well, we can dry this. We can take this up to about, if you go above 240, while you begin to get what's called blue haze, but up to about 240, this will dry in probably 3 or 4 hours.
Can you put a dry stick through that machine?
No. No, the dry is much harder to cut.
Up to about an inch in diameter, no problem. And we are working on another blade that will do dry as large as the green.
Did everyone hear that? Because we're losing it with if there's no mics there, Phil. That's okay. Say it again louder. Can you do green
Manzanita is really the toughest of all the woods because it has stratas of dry and green mixed together. It also has the highest BTU rating of any of the woods. I believe that's 12,000 BTUs. So it's the toughest of them to do.
It's tough, but it's worth the trouble because it's a very attractive wood, and it has around 11,000 BTUs a pound when it's dry. So
With the stove, too.
yeah, Manzanita has been the focus of this whole thing because in a forest fire, it's almost impossible to even get close enough to even think of putting it out. So if this works, and it's, there's we actually weighed, using prison labor, we weighed what comes off of an acre, and it was 44,000 pounds per acre, 22 tons. And so that's the equivalent of about 3,000 gallons of gas that we could harvest off of an acre of Manzanita. And boy, we have many, many acres of Manzanita in Mendocino County.
I recently was looking on Craigslist and saw one of those old kitchen stoves with a trash burner on it. Remember those? It was a Wedgwood 30 stove. You could do propane, natural gas, or burn, they call it a trash burner, but these chunkettes would be perfect for that kind of a cooking device, actually. Now, don't you guys run out and get that Wedgwood. I want it first, but look for those old stoves with trash burners. It might be just the perfect thing. You have one? Mary has one. So
Well, that
I'd
goes over
love
to
to
Phil.
love to engage you with Ed in conversation, and if you want to use the mic and get some questions, you'll be on TV. Otherwise, we'll just hang around and discuss stuff. Are there any burning questions that we could ask Ed that would help clarify some of these inventions or your ideas about what he's done? Okay, Erica wants to know what that yellow stick is over there. You want to tell us about that, Ed or Phil?
Yellow?
Ed,
That
this
yellow,
is something that you just ordered, and this is something that we do a lot at EBC. We try out other people's things
yeah.
as well. This is something that Ed ordered, and what it is for is pulling brush out of the ground by its roots. And I just assembled this for him, and we haven't even tried it out yet. I'm really anxious to bring it out in the field. But we're
Yeah,
always
this is a
looking-
great invention, I hope.
Yeah. So what you do with it is you go up to a bush, you open this lever here and slide that up to the bush, slam it shut down near the roots, and then lean on this end, and what it's supposed to do is pull it out of the ground. So again, I just put this together from a kit, and that's sort of what we do at EBC, is test things. Yeah.
One more thing, just to kind of bring this back around to what we've been talking about tonight is a lot about biomass and forest products and value adding what we have here. So just to bring it back around to that summary, what Ed and Phil are working on and what Ed's been really doing his whole life is figuring out what to do with what you have. And so we want to encourage everyone here to, find out more about what Ed's doing, invent your own things. We could be starting a lot of small businesses. I wish we did have a better business incubator system up here, but there's lots of things that could be done with our biomass, and these guys are actually using what is considered trash and would be slashed and burned and make a terrible inversion layer and so on, and turning it into something really valuable, value adding. So part of what we want you to go away with tonight is the sense that there's a future, a bright future for us here with these incredible innovators in our midst, and yourself as one of those invention-oriented folk. Ed, do you want to say anything in closing?
Yeah, the big hurdle that we have is water. And one of the features of this is after we gasify it, the hydrogen, the gas that we make from wood is 60% hydrogen and 30% carbon monoxide, and the other 10% is other gases. So if you burn this hydrogen-rich gas, all of those hydrogens unite with oxygen, and of course oxygen has an atomic weight of 16, hydrogen is just 1, so H2O has an atomic weight of 18, which is 9 times the weight of the gas. And in the case of propane, which is C3H8, why it comes to 13 times a gallon of propane. When it burns, it produces, and then you condense all of the water vapor that comes from that burning, you get 13 gallons of water. And that'll be in the column on Wednesday, incidentally. But that is the thing that we're pursuing, because we plan to cool the gas that from the burning of these chunkettes using the wastewater, which is much cooler. We can't really afford the refrigeration to cool the air, cool the water vapor, but we can use the latent heat in the treated sewage to cool the water and make more water. So that is a possibility, along with our rotating fill jester, which removes the solids and digests them in the wastewater field. So I'm optimistic of what we can do here on our own without any of the others. And of course, if we're successful, then they got to pay us. And if they steal our patent, we get triple damages. So best thing that happened to an inventor is have someone steal your patent. And so that's it.
All right, Ed, great. Well, thank you, Ed. Wonderful.